Okay, why don't we open with prayer? Dear Lord, thank you for letting us all be in your house to hear your word, and please help us to continue to grow in our discipleship and our ability to not be afraid when we're witnessing to the outside world. Turns out they're not really that terrifying after all. So strengthen us in faith and in knowledge that will underpin our ability to witness, make a good witness unto you. Amen. Okay. So last week we did an introduction and I almost got through it. But the one thing I wanted to talk about just a little bit was resources. So again, part of the reason for this class is to really arm you to know what good resources are for furthering your education in apologetics, or somebody someday runs into you with a really hard question that you don't have an answer for. There are a lot of good writers out there, apologists, that are extremely wise and have done a lot of research into the ancient documents and everything else. And they've captured this in a lot of books. We have put a lot of these books back on the table so you can kind of look at what some of them are. I'll go quickly through some of the names that I think are really the principal people to listen to when you're dealing with apologetics. Like I said, last week, there's an audio series that John Warwick Montgomery did. It was back in the 70s, so you can purchase it, I think, off of 1517.org, called Sensible Christianity. And it's really a excellent audio series. I mean, the audio is not always perfect because you can hear them flipping the cassette tapes over, which I can relate to. But he really covers a lot of ground and does it he's an excellent speaker. So that series is called Sensible Christianity. I think you can get it for like $25 or something, so it's not bad. And it's like 15 episodes. So if you put it on a thumb drive, you can listen to it in your car or whatever. It's really great. Defending the Faith in a Messy World is a newer book that Dr. Montgomery did. History of Law and Christianity is another book. It's not on the table because I actually have it on Kindle. Faith Founded on Fact is another Montgomery book. So again, you can see a lot of these books on the back. And what I would recommend is skim through them and look at what the table of contents shows. And maybe I'll even shoot pictures of the table of contents of a lot of these books and make them a little appendix to this beastly outline, so that if you run into a specific question, you can kind of look at what topics are covered in the different apologetics texts and figure out which one is right to go by and learn more. Resurrection Fact is a series of essays that were edited by John Bombaro and Dr. Adam from Francisco. Objections Overruled 1 and 2, those are both back on the back table, and I think those are put out by Issues, etc. But they're both excellent. Again, a collection of different topics that authors write about, disputing or answering questions about the historicity of the Bible, or answering common objections that people have to the Christian faith. So all of those are really good. Here's one with a scary title. Tractatus Logico-Theologicus. I mean, you need to buy that just so you sound smart. It's written by Dr. Montgomery, and I, as an engineer, I love this book because it thinks the way I think. So essentially, the Tractatus Logico-Theologicus is logical treatise or tracts on theology. There's another one by a guy named Wittgenstein on Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which I want to buy just again because it's got a cool title, right? But what's nice about it is, and you'll see this in the references on the slides and in the handouts, but it'll have numbering, a statement, and the number will be for that thought. Like you'll have a 3.2537, where 3 is like the chapter, and then 2 is the statement, and then if he needs to make a logical developing argument for the statement, why that statement is true, he makes an argument for that statement, so that would be a sub-bullet and a sub-bullet and a sub-bullet. So you can end up with very long things, but what's cool about it is you can go directly to the sentence in this book based on the reference, the way it's documented. So I think it's cool. But it's got a scary title, but it's an easy to read book mostly. Sometimes there are some like colloquial expressions in French or something he doesn't translate because we all know that. We do not. Case for the Real Jesus. I've probably heard of Lee Strobel. He was a journalist that went after Christianity to disprove it like a good investigative reporter would, and ended up becoming a Christian, which happens when a lot of people investigate the underpinning facts behind the Christian faith. The Case for the Real Jesus. I said that one. The Case for Christ is the other one. It's probably on here, but I'm not saying it. Case for Christ and The Case for the Real Jesus are both Lee Strobel books. Defense Never Rests is Craig Parton. That's from a legal standpoint, like looking at it strict, like with rules of evidence kind of thing. So he argues it from a lawyer's perspective. Then some books by Dr. Nancy Motivar. They were eyewitnesses, Reason for Reason, and Nothing Else Matters. They're small books. They're very easy to read, and they're great. Creedal Apologetics is another one. Historical Jesus by Gary Habermas. He's not another one of the kind of really talented Christian apologists, and I think he has YouTube videos out there also. Tactics is a different sort of book. Tactics, and the new one called Street Smarts are written by a guy named Greg Koukl. And what he does, and we'll probably cover this in later sessions, he attacks witness in the model of Columbo, the detective series from the 70s. And basically you witness to people by doing nothing but asking questions. And so it's much less confrontational and terrifying if you can just ask questions to get about what they believe, and through asking questions lead them to understand where the holes are in their beliefs. Now, of course, you have to be ready to fill those holes, right? So it's not a matter of attacking their faith, which never puts people in a good spot, right? You attack their faith, they just get defensive and shut down. That's not the point. So the point is just to, like he says, put a pebble in their shoe. So if they're really comfortable, they probably haven't thought about, why they believe what they believe. And so that gives a way for them to have to wrestle with why is it that I believe, that I'm spiritual and not religious, and that God is just the universe, and these things that sound almost really smart, and you start really thinking hard about them or asking questions about them, they fall apart very quickly. So it's a great strategy. New Testament Documents by F.F. Bruce. I think I have that one on Kindle, so you won't see that one. Anyway, there are a lot of great writers out there, and hopefully in all cases I've referenced them when we get to a point where I'm quoting them directly, or mostly quoting them.
I've watched his videos, and he's got some good videos. It's Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace.
Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. It's been around a long time, and he was looking at it from a judicial point of view also. Right. He was an atheist that turned to be a Christian based on studying the evidence.
He did the same thing. He tried to prove that it wasn't true and became a Christian.
Right.
Because he was convinced that it is true. Yeah. I do not own that, but I've seen a number of his videos, and he's really good.
Great. Yeah. You think about it, C.S. Lewis was an atheist. And again, he studied it from a kind of a hostile perspective, ended up becoming a Christian. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about why do you think something is true or not. This is a field called epistemology. So what is epistemology other than a really cool sounding word? It comes from a Greek word, episteme, which means to know, and logos just meaning word. So it really translates to, it's a study of truth. It's a study of why we think something is true or not true. So different people have different epistemologies. I as an engineer, am probably going to have a different way of convincing myself something is true or not versus somebody else who's an artist, say, for example. I mean, there may be a totally different approach that we use. And again, I think apologetics probably goes really well with the hard sciences like engineering, because we go where the data goes. So if we're trying to find out what's happening, for example, in politics, here's a question about your epistemology. So how do you get to a point of believing something is true in the world of politics? Do you have certain news resources you listen to? Do you listen to a bunch of different sources? Do you follow 10 different people on Twitter that are right, left, center? When people are talking about a court decision or a Supreme Court decision, do you listen to people that you have a lot of trust in discussing it, or do you go download it and read it yourself? So everybody has a different approach to how they come to agree to convince themselves that what they believe is actually true. And it's important, we'll see why it's important for us to think about it, because when people are rejecting the claims of Christianity, sometimes, let's say their epistemology is not very tight, like they haven't really actually thought about it. Possibly, or they've thought about it, they've had things poorly presented to them, and they rejected them because, again, the straw man. If people form a really heterodox version of Christianity that has open holes that can be disproved by science, then you've got a problem. Now that's a straw man that can be knocked down really easily. So it's important how we get to the fact. And this apologetics is very much a science-based approach to understanding why we believe that the gospel texts are primary historical documents and not fantasies from the 2nd century, 3rd century church that they developed. So, if you're seeking a true religion, how do you do that? How do you decide that the religion you're in is the right one? I mean, you're born into a certain religion, or your parents were the same religion, or maybe you never came into a religion and you ran into friends that were a certain religion. How do you decide that that religion is true or not? Do you try them all, one alphabetically, and then, with the guideline being the first one that makes me feel good in my heart must be the right religion? Well, that's not necessarily a good way to do it. But a lot of Christian denominations really do the try it and you'll like it approach. And again, that's especially Mormonism from a non-Christian denomination, but Mormonism is very much a try it, read the book, and you'll feel it in your heart. So we don't have to play in that territory because we have a better story. So we all know this, but does the Bible say that the disciples, the followers of Christ, are going to have a luxurious, easy life? No, right? Pick up your cross and follow me. No, don't pick up your suntan lotion and follow me, right? Okay. So our approach in apologetics is going to be to study the data and see where it leads us.
I just don't need it today. Because like I said, we're not doing advantage tests for Tuesday.
So, sometimes the data doesn't lead where you think it's going to lead. Right? I mean, you're kind of opening yourself up. If I'm going to go where the data, the evidence leads, sometimes, heaven forbid, it may not agree with me. I've had this happen recently on a science-related thing, where at work, I was absolutely convinced about the electrical properties of this material, this plastic material. And some friends of mine at Los Alamos suggested that the electrical properties of this material could change. You apply a higher voltage to it, it changes its electrical properties. Well, I said, okay, well maybe a little bit, but not a lot, right? So I went off and tested it. And when I saw the data, I might have said a bad word. Because not only did it change its electrical properties, it changed its electrical properties by 9 orders of magnitude. I mean, not a little change, a massive change. And I would have swore that was not possible. So sometimes the data doesn't exactly agree with you, and as a scientist, you go where the data goes. I mean, what did they do with the photon when they figured out it's a wave and it's a particle? They divide into photon denominations of the particle denomination versus the wave denomination? No.
I don't know how many times at night I've laid awake thinking about that very issue.
Okay. Well, We'll talk about it a little bit more, probably not enough to satisfy your intellectual curiosity on the photon. So, oddly enough, in apologetics, we don't start with the Bible as the inerrant word of God. We'll get there, but that's not where we start. We start off with the Bible as a historical text, and we study that historical text to determine whether we think it is valid or not. So, with any text like that, there are established mechanisms for deciding whether something is truly reliable as a historical text. And we'll talk about this with lower and higher criticism. But the point is just to decide first, are the gospel texts reliable primary historical sources, or are they myths created way after Jesus came and was resurrected, or what is the validity of those texts? So I mentioned last week, theology and science are not enemies. You're not asked to check your brain at the door when you come into the church. They're not in opposition to each other, but in our society it seems like they've been placed as enemies to each other. Okay, so again, the data doesn't always lead where you want. Last week we talked about the old farmer that went to the zoo and saw a giraffe for the first time and stared at it and just said, there ain't no such animal, and turned around and walked away. So I mean, even being led by the data to a conclusion, you can still decide just to reject it. But at that point, it's not really an intellectual argument anymore. It's more of a moral argument. So remember our fundamental principle. Your goal is to bring the person to understand the same logic they use to make decisions in everyday life is what is needed to bring them to accept the validity of the biblical text. So we're not asking them to have some deep, dark, secret knowledge. We're asking them to use the same decision process that they use to decide whether they're going to cross the street or not, and apply that same logical process to the study of whether the Christian faith holds together or not. So we're going to do a little bit of philosophy now, which I'm sure everybody's excited about. We're going to talk about different kinds of statements, and we're going to group them into different categories: analytic, synthetic, and meaningless. The names are not important, and, although I think the names are kind of cool. I think it's good to group these into, I think it's good to hold on to these categories, because sometimes when somebody's telling you something, they're making a statement, it helps if you understand whether that statement is something that, as it's set up, can be defended, or whether it is purely something you have to have faith, blind faith in. Okay, first category, analytic. So analytic statements are definitional. Example, 2 + 2 = 4. So you don't need evidence to demonstrate that 2 + 2 makes 4. If you got 2 of one thing, you got 2 of another thing, then you've got 4 of that thing. It's axiomatic. There are proofs for mathematics, right? But they don't require you to collect evidence. We're going to put 2 and 2 together 1,000 times to make sure it always comes out to 4, right? They're definitional. Single men are bachelors. Married men are husbands. The definitional. It doesn't require testing, and they are 100% true at all times. They will never be wrong. So analytic statements don't require defense that they're probably correct, or correct most of the time, because they're definitions. They're axioms. You don't have to gather evidence to figure them out, and they are 100% reliable. So synthetic that's a small category of statements. A lot of statements are actually something called synthetic. So a synthetic statement is probabilistic. And I will give you an example that we'll count chairs first. So if I say there are 30 chairs in this room, is that an analytic statement, or is that a statement that by definition is true? Or is that a statement that requires you to look around and count chairs? So, I won't make you count chairs. Let's just say I can see 30 chairs in this room right now. And you can look around and you can count them and decide whether I'm correct or not. So if you count 30 chairs after I said there are 30 chairs in the room, is that 100% certainty? What if there are chairs hiding behind the dry erase board over there that are folded up against the wall and we just don't see them? So you can gather data against my claim and say, well, I see 30 chairs, but is that 100% certain there's actually 30 chairs, only 30 chairs in this room? No. So that is not an analytic statement. It's not based on a definition like 2 + 2 = 4. It is a statement that requires people, if they want to determine whether it's valid or not, they actually have to look around and gather evidence on it. And there's never 100% certainty with any synthetic statement that it is 100% true. It really is something, the only things that are 100% true are analytic statements. They are pure form, pure definition. They're not things that you need to test and gather evidence for. Okay, I'll give you some examples of this so we can talk about it a little bit more. So, if you're deciding whether you're going to cross a street, you think about what your mental process is. You look left, right, and left again if you're in the U.S., otherwise you reverse that, and make a decision that it is highly unlikely that you're going to get run over. Does that mean it's impossible that you're going to get run over? Make the cars move, that's cooler. Does it mean, we've seen the coyote in Roadrunner movies, right? And the coyote looks both ways and makes sure there's no roadrunner coming, and then steps out into the street, and what happens? He gets flattened. So you're never assured that you're going to make it across the street. Especially now we got electric cars. The Tesla, some teenager stole his father's Tesla or borrowed his father's Tesla, and he's going down Granada Avenue at 200 miles an hour, then you're looking left and right. It may not be adequate to get you across the street. So there's always a chance that you don't have enough evidence to prove it with 100% certainty. But when you decide to cross the street, you don't take 80% of you across the street. You take 100% of you across the street. So you've made a decision that is life and death based on probability that you're going to make it across the street. And there's a lot of examples where we do this. We do it all the time. So you eat at a restaurant knowing there's some probability you'll get food poisoning that makes you ill or kills you. So what's your epistemological approach for deciding whether it's okay to eat at that restaurant or not? Do you look at reviews online? Do you look at count how many cars are actually parked in that parking lot? Do you look at call the health department and see if they've flagged that restaurant as having problems with food poisoning? Do you rely on what other friends tell you? How many other friends tell you they like it? So you have an epistemology, you just don't have the fancy word for it. You have an epistemology for deciding whether there's enough evidence for you to eat at that restaurant. Now, how much evidence you require is really based on just your personality. So some people will drop into a random restaurant with one car in front of it in a town they've never been at and just caution to the wind. But that's fine. They've decided they need 1% certainty of the evidence being true before they eat at that restaurant. Others might need overwhelming evidence before they eat at the restaurant.
You mean something like eating a puffer fish sushi in North Dakota?
Yeah, don't eat puffer fish anywhere. That's definitely the person who has thrown caution to the wind, right, if you're eating puffer fish. I have a legendarily bad time with breakfast burritos. There are multiple restaurants that I don't go to anymore because I just have really bad luck with breakfast burritos. But that's okay. I make them. It'll make them much safer if you make them yourself. How about you're driving and you decide that you have enough time to make a left turn across multiple lanes of oncoming traffic? We do that all the time. That's a full contact sport driving in Amarillo, Texas now, right?
Good thing you went to church first on Sunday morning.
Right.
Trying to make a left turn on hillside.
Yeah, if you're trying to turn out onto the hillside here, you really are risking it. And then people let the trees grow up, so you know your probability of being incorrect grows increasingly high as the trees grow increasingly opaque and you can't see through them to see whether there are cars coming at you or not. The point is, you weigh evidence every day when you're making a decision that is life and death decision. So, and you don't always rely on, nearly getting to the point of complete certainty before you make these life and death decisions. So the claim that, what is the claim that overwhelming claims require overwhelming evidence, something like that, doesn't really make any sense. That's not the way we live our life in any other venue, right? You don't require overwhelming evidence to the point of 100% certainty before you eat a breakfast burrito, but maybe you should. So what Christian apologists do, we engage in that. We recognize that saying the gospel texts are primary source historical documents, that is a synthetic statement. It's not definitional. It requires the gathering of evidence to figure out whether that's true or not. And then we embark on the gathering of the evidence. But you've got to get people off of the whole, I need 100% certainty. Kind of like I said before, what are the only kinds of statements that are 100% certainly true? Analytic statements, right? The definitional statements. So you don't really get anything out of saying that I need 100% certainty for God, because now you've turned God just into a definition, not into a divine being. It's just a definition at that point. Does that make sense? Okay. So we don't expect to get to 100% certainty of the truth claims of Christianity. We don't expect to completely eliminate any possibility of there being errors, contradictions, whatever in the Bible. That's not a reasonable goal, and that's not the goal we have as apologists. But what we can get to is the weight of the evidence is overwhelming in favor of the Christian claims versus other claims. So, we start from evidence and work towards a theory. We've got all these books that say a person named Jesus came into the world, claimed to be God, died, resurrected, and ascended visibly in front of witnesses. So that's the evidence. And we'll talk about the validity of the evidence more. But at that point, now what's your theory as to why that happened? Pretty much you're left with one thing, and that's Jesus was God. Because, it would be very difficult for any of us to bodily ascend into heaven no matter how much time we spend at the gym. So again, if you take bits and pieces of evidence or work from a theory and then go backwards and try to gather little bits and pieces of evidence that support your theory and maybe shuffle the ones that don't support your theory under the rug, that's not good scholarship, right? If you're writing, and this can happen in the church, if you're writing a sermon that you want it to say X, and you find yourself sifting through 7 different versions, translations, or paraphrases of the Bible in order to find proof texts for your assertion, that's probably not a good sermon, as opposed to working from what the text actually says and standing up there and faithfully proclaiming what the text says, even if you don't like it. So we have to watch out for something called confirmation bias, and if you don't know what that is, here's a definition off of Britannica. Confirmation bias is people's tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that is consistent with their existing beliefs. This biased approach to decision making is largely unintentional and results in a person ignoring information that is inconsistent with their beliefs. These beliefs can include a person's expectations in a given situation and their predictions about a particular outcome. People are especially likely to process information to support their own beliefs when an issue is highly important or self-evident. So when I discovered the magical material that changed properties by 9 orders of magnitude, I didn't just hide the evidence and say, y'all are wrong, I'm right, because David can never be wrong. David's ego is that fragile. He cannot be wrong. Therefore, I'm obviously not saying that. I'll throw the meter into the dumpster and ignore the evidence, right? Confirmation bias. So there's another type of argument, another type of statement that is not analytic and not synthetic. And the term given to this is just that it's meaningless or technically meaningless. It doesn't necessarily mean that it means nothing. It just doesn't fit either of the other two categories. So what are technically meaningless statements? An example would be there are 8 invisible men in the room. You can't touch them or smell them either. I make that claim. Is that a synthetic statement? It sounds like it's a synthetic statement. It sounds like something we need to go gather data for, but the way I've set it up, can you gather any data for it? Because I purposely constructed it in a manner that is untestable. So that is essentially a technically meaningless statement because I can say it. It might sound like it's meaningful, but since it is set up to be untestable, then there's no point in spending any time thinking about it further. So a funny example mentioned by Dr. Montgomery is a college professor who writes in the margins of a colleague's paper, "This isn't right. In fact, it isn't even wrong." There are things that you can say that are neither right nor wrong. They're just simply completely set up in a way that they're untestable. And I think it's like an epic burn, so it's great. So, if something is constructed in a way where it's inherently untestable, then it doesn't deserve our time looking into it further. And the reason I bring that up is some religions are set up that way. So what? Why are we doing philosophy? Why are we doing epistemology? Well, we can start, it'll help us when we're hearing people say what they think their beliefs are justified by, and we can figure out whether their belief structure is really based on synthetic or technically meaningless assertions. And that can guide how we do our apologetics. So there's an example in one of Greg Kokel's book, Street Smarts, which honestly I'm only about a third of the way through, so I'm going to stall and talk about that one more later.
It just came out.
Yeah, it just came out. I've read Tactics, which is an earlier book by him, and it's similar to that, but it's really a good book. Again, more on that to come. So, an example he gives, a waitress, formerly a Christian, who now says that the universe takes care of her and that God is the universe. What kind of statement is that? It's a technically meaningless statement, right? How would you ever prove that right or wrong? God is the universe. So it's set up in a manner that's untestable. Okay. So, historicity of the Bible. Well, any questions about our little delve into epistemology and why we believe something is true versus not true? We'll go into historicity of the Bible. This is something called textual criticism or lower criticism that we'll start with. The term is not important. But why do we care whether the Bible is a credible historical document? You have to have an object of faith. I say, well, my faith is great. My faith has never been stronger. My faith in what? We have to have an object of our faith. And what do we believe about that object? Again, saying, I believe in Jesus doesn't get you there, right? Satan believes in Jesus. So what do we believe about Jesus is really the critical thing. And how are we going to figure out what Jesus said about himself? We're going to look at the primary historical documents and see what they say. See what Jesus said about himself. So the gospel texts, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, describe the object of our faith. We have faith in Jesus, God in flesh, who came to earth to reconcile all of mankind unto himself. His arrival and his explanations about what he was going to do to solve our ultimate problem, death, and the description of him accomplishing his task is all captured in great detail by multiple eyewitnesses. So, which is great for us We can't be eyewitnesses to things that happened, a couple thousand years ago. But we have great eyewitnesses that wrote stuff down, and the way it is given to us is very reliable, and that's what lower criticism aims to prove. So there are two ways to convey. There are two ways to convey information about someone who hasn't met them. We kind of talked about this last week. Descriptive, where you just sit there and do an endless monologue trying to explain what something looks like, or denotative. You put the thing on the table in front of them and say, there, look at it, touch it, smell it, feel it. You'll understand it better having seen it. So, fortunately for us, God chose to appear in person so that his followers would have a better understanding of him, as opposed to remaining only a figure of prophecy. So, John says this in John 14. Philip said to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. And Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. So God presents himself to us denotatively. Because we're relying heavily on the gospel accounts for his life, death, and resurrection, it's important to establish their credibility as primary source historical documents. And it's of primary importance for people hostile to the Christian faith to try to discredit the gospel texts, because that's the evidence that's against their position. So it's critical for them to try to find fault, find things wrong with it. Okay, so what we find is the New Testament documents are the primary source records for the determination of Jesus' life and work, and are historically veracious. It's from Dr. Montgomery. That statement is synthetic, that these are primary source records and are historically veracious. That is very much a synthetic, not an analytic, and certainly not a technically meaningless argument. So, lower textual criticism. To determine the reliability of any historical document, authenticity is established using established methods of examination. The three principal tests are the bibliographical, the internal, and the external tests. Now, we're not just, again, we have not started with the Bible as the inerrant Word of God. We are starting with the Bible as historical documents. And just like any other historical document, whether it's the Bible or the dialogues of Plato or Homer or whatever, you're going to take the same approach when you're trying to determine whether they are handed to us faithfully. Does the text agree with what the text originally said? What does the text purport to say about itself? And if there are events being mentioned in the text, are there any hostile witnesses or anybody else that wrote about it that were in other texts that are not the four Gospels? And you look at all of that stuff, put it all together, and what do you get? You get very high statistical probability that the Gospel texts are in excellent shape as far as being valid, historical, reliable documents, which is good for us. Okay, so let's start with the bibliographical test. So by bibliographical test, and a lot of this is out of Dr. Montgomery's Sensible Christianity or the Tractatus. By bibliographical test, we mean the analysis of the textual tradition by which the given document reaches us. That means how faithfully is it copied from one person to the next. And in the ancient days, they were really good at faithful copying of texts. In the case of the New Testament documents, the question is, are the printed texts, as we have them today, essentially the same as when they were originally written, or have they been significantly corrupted in translation? Or in translation, by that can mean copying also. So translation from one person to the next person to the next person. It's not necessarily from, Greek to English. Texts which were written close to the date of actual recorded events are inherently stronger bibliographically than texts that were written far after the event. So that makes sense, right? If you're writing about something that you witnessed 10 years ago versus something that you witnessed yesterday, isn't your account going to be better? And what we find, and we'll dive into this deeper here in a minute, but what we find is the gospel texts were written very close to the time of the events that they purport to describe. They're not written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the events. And that sets them apart from a lot of other historical documents that actually, there's a huge time span between the events or the original writing and the manuscripts that we have available today. So here's the statement. New Testament documents are the primary source records for the determination of Jesus' life and work and are historically veracious. Let's talk a little bit about some of the dates. So this is from the Lutheran Study Bible of 2001, and we say approximate dating of the New Testament books and letters. And so they've kind of got early estimate and a late estimate. And there's a lot of thought and science that goes into this. Scholars that spend a lot of time trying to figure out the proper dating of these books. But you can see the early dates are, again, AD is Day of the Lord, not after death. So it's not 50 years after his death. It's 20 years after his death, right? So you have Matthew, James, Mark, and Luke all were written. Okay, it's generally believed Mark was the first one. There's not 100% consensus on that, but it's generally believed that Mark was the earliest gospel. So that's only 50 years. So 20 years after, 17 to 20 years after the death of Jesus, which in that time period is amazing that you're starting to get manuscripts that were circulating around that are extremely old. We may not have the manuscript that was written in 50, but we have manuscripts that were fragments of papyri that date back to 150. And that's still extremely early, very, very close to the events. And we will, in a few minutes, compare that to the dates of other historical documents that are pretty much universally believed to be accurate documents, historically valid documents, but there's vast expanses of time between the events and the writings that we have available. So, note that these date estimates actually may even be later than the actual texts. So in the History, Law, and Christianity, W.F. Albright says that, in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and 80s of the first century A.D. Very probably between AD 50 and 75, which agrees with the graph that the timeline we were just looking at. So an analysis of the textual tradition of the writings. So how well were the original texts preserved? Have they been significantly altered over time? This is called lower textual criticism. There was a person named Erasmus who traveled to various monasteries and examined the original Greek texts, noting the apparent age of the scrolls. He produced the first critical edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516. That was translated into the King James Version, and subsequent volumes produced using more modern scholarship made very few changes to the 1516 work, resulting in the revised King James and other translations. So when Erasmus went from monastery to monastery, he would look at the scrolls and say, oh, this one looks very old, and this one looks not so old, and he created this Greek New Testament. And interestingly enough, even though other scholars, and he did not have all the benefits of modern scientific techniques of dating ancient texts, and despite that, when future editions, future researchers that went back and looked at what should have been the Greek translation of those manuscripts, agreed with what Erasmus had. They had enough information, enough copies. Variability is just fine in some of the copies because they were hand copied. And what he ended up with was very close to what we have today. I mean, no substantive changes. I'm going to read something from, what time is it? Okay. I'm going to read something from Dr. Montgomery, and the whole section on the New Testament documents being the primary source records is a great section. But again, we're trying to do kind of the survey of Christian apologetics, not the deep dive into Christian apologetics. So, but I recommend if you're really interested in understanding the whole, why are the New Testament documents reliable historical records, and how to deal with people who say there are a lot of contradictions and errors in the texts, the great resource, one of the great resources is Montgomery. So he's quoting somebody else. So Sir Frederick Kenyon was the principal librarian of the British Museum. So needless to say, a sharp dude. So Kenyon says, the New Testament text is far better attested than that of any work of ancient literature. And he would know. Its problems arise not from a deficiency of evidence, but from an excess of it. In the case of no work of Greek or Latin literature do we possess manuscripts so plentiful in number or so near the date of composition. Apart from Virgil, who's a poet, if you've done Dante's Inferno, Virgil is the poet that's leading him through the circles of hell. Anyway, of whom we have manuscripts written some 300 or 400 years after the poet's death. 300 or 400 years after the poet's death. The normal position with regard to great works of classical literature is that our knowledge of their text depends on a few, or at most a few dozen manuscripts, of which the earliest may be in the 9th or 10th or 11th century, but most of the 15th. In these conditions, it generally happens that scientific criticism has selected one manuscript, not necessarily even the oldest, as a principal authority and has based our printed text on this, with some assistance from the later and inferior manuscripts and a liberal use of conjecture. It's not a good thing. In the case of the New Testament, the vellum manuscripts are far earlier and far more numerous. The gap between the earliest of them and the date of composition of the books is smaller, and the larger number of papyri have, especially since the discovery of the Chester Beatty papyri, given us better means of bridging the gap. We are far better equipped to observe the early stages of the textual history in the manuscript period in the case of the New Testament than of any other work of ancient literature. So that's Sir Frederick Kenyon and recent developments in the textual criticism of the Greek Bible. So the bottom line is they were written close. We have a lot of manuscripts. We have a lot of papyri fragments. And if you see little differences from one manuscript to the next, it doesn't necessarily call them into question. It's like if you have multiple witnesses to an event and they give a slightly different eyewitness testimony, it doesn't discredit their testimony. What would discredit their testimony is if they all said exactly the same thing, because what would that imply? Collusion, right? So the fact that they're saying slightly different things actually strengthens their case. And when we talk about, the Bard Ehrman, there's a lot of errors and contradictions in the Bible. We'll talk more about that. But if you've got 2,500 manuscripts, then wouldn't you expect to find one that says Jesus said and another one that said he said? And does that really call into question the validity of the Bible? None of the so-called errors and contradictions actually call into question what the Bible says. Okay, some more from, this is Dr. Montgomery. Okay. The New Testament text is far better attested than that of any other work of ancient literature. Okay, this is segments from the Kenyon text that I just read later aloud. So between the dates of the original composition and the earliest complete text of the Gospels, which we possess, that's about 350 AD is the oldest one we have that's complete. There are existing fragments, quotations, and lectionary readings going back to the end of the first century and possibly even earlier. So while the complete one that we have is 350 AD, we have fragments that go all the way back into the 150 AD kind of, and we have a lot of them. So besides the number, the manuscripts of the New Testament differ from those of other classical authors. In no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest extant manuals so short as in that of the New Testament. The interval between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially and any doubt that they have come down to us substantially as they were written have now been removed. That's still Sir Frederick Kenyon. So, principal librarian of the British Museum, knowing the historicity of other classical literature and comparing it to the historicity, the textual criticism, the validity of the New Testament, sees a vast difference between the two. And the New Testament finds itself in a very good spot. So, okay, so there exists a fragment of the fourth gospel which must be dated no later than the end of the first century, thus eliminating the speculations of such critics as Bultmann that the gospel reflects second century Gnostic influences. We'll see a picture of it in a future class. So if you say the New Testament texts are not reliable documents, then you must throw out all knowledge of historical persons or events which are more poorly attested. In other words, throw out all knowledge of the ancient world. So here are some examples. Caesar's Gallic Wars, written in 58 to 50 BC, survived today on the basis of approximately 10 manuscripts, the oldest of which is dated 900 years after the events. Thucydides' history, as well as Herodotus' history, are known through 8 manuscripts, and the earliest is dated around AD 900, so 500 years. The poems of Roman playwright Callus are known from just 3 manuscripts, the earliest of which dates from the late 14th century, and he's from 84, 85 BC. So that's 1,500 years later, right? Okay. So no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts are of use to us are over 1,300 years later than the originals. So if you're studying classics in college, you'll study the text, but they're not going to tell you, well, these are probably wrong because the oldest versions we have are 1,300 years after the event, before they were actually created. Here's examples. Homer, when it was written, 900 BC, and the earliest copy we have is from around 400 BC, so look at the time span. And these are accepted texts and if you're studying the classics. The Gallic Wars, we talked about 900, so they're 1,000 years after the event. Plato's tetralogies is 1,200 years, Aristotle 1,400 years, and look how many copies there are. I mean, there's a lot of the Homer copies, 643, but look how many of the Plato documents you have, 7? So if you have a fewer number of manuscripts to work from, then obviously it's going to be more possible that you have errors in the transcribing, right? But look at the New Testament. The time span is approximately 30 years, and we have 24,000 manuscripts to work from. Yeah, 30-ish years. So we believe that the dating of the first texts were written based on what the texts say. They were written within about 30 years of Jesus' death, right? So, and there are arguments for that. I think we'll probably talk about it some more, but there are arguments for that, like the fact that the book of Acts, which is essentially a book that talks a lot about Paul's travels, Paul's missionary journeys, does not mention Paul's death, which happened in the Neronian persecution in about 64 AD. And if you're going to write a story that's essentially the biography of Paul, wouldn't you think it's important to mention his death? but it doesn't. It stops with him still in his missionary journeys, and that's where the book ends. So it has to be dated before 64. It's part 2 of Acts, or it's part 2 of Luke, which had to be written before that. And anyway, you start going through that logical chain, I think we talk about it, and you find out that these had to be written based on what they say. They had to be written very early. Otherwise, they would have said different stuff. Okay, so when people like Bart Ehrman say there are more errors or contradictions in the New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament, it's only because there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of manuscripts, fragments of papyri, etc. So when one manuscript says he said and another says Jesus said, that would count as an error/contradiction in Bart Ehrman's mind. None of the so-called errors or contradictions call into question the central teaching of the New Testament. So Bart Ehrman was raised in a Christian church. He was in a fundamentalist Christian church and left it, got tired of it, saw too much what he thought was odd stuff. And so he bailed out. So he's still considered a New Testament scholar and very good at his scholarship up until the point where he starts saying what his scholarship actually means. In other words, you want him for dates and that kind of thing. He's an excellent New Testament scholar. But as soon as he starts saying, and because of that, here's what all of this means, you should turn off the television, it's about. Because he is not a friend of Christianity. Okay, the books of the New Testament are admissible evidence in a court of law. This is from The Defense Never Rests, Craig Parton, a lawyer. In short, from a lawyer's viewpoint, these documents, the New Testament texts, are in solid shape and would surely, as Simon Greenleaf argued, be admissible under the so-called ancient documents exception to the hearsay rule. They give no evidence of tampering. They're all well attested as coming from a strong tradition of manuscript evidence, arise almost on top of the events they record, and have no peer among all works of antiquity based on the sheer number of excellent and early manuscript copies. The documents are reliable historically, applying the commonly accepted canons of historical scholarship used to determine if any work that predates the printing press has reached us in substantially the same shape in which it was authored. So I highly recommend that book. Craig Parton's book is great. Okay, Sir Edmund Clark, a British High Court judge. To me, the evidence is conclusive. And over again, in the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. As a lawyer, I accept the gospel evidence unreservedly as the testimony of truthful men to facts that they were able to substantiate. Again, they were eyewitnesses. They weren't playing the telephone game where they were passing down a tradition that was an ancient tradition, right? Oral tradition, although they were very good at that too. So that's the external, or that's the bibliographical test, right? You look at the book and you figure out how faithfully has what was originally written been handed to us. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If the documents can be determined to be very old, they happen very close to the time, they were written very close to the time that they are purporting to report on, and you have a lot of copies of them that you can reconstruct the original from, even if the little copies that you have slight differences in grammar or whatever. Sometimes even things like a double a double N in Greek will count as an error in the manuscripts, right? But again, none of those supposed errors and contradictions actually amount to anything that would challenge the text. So we're in a really great spot in Christianity at saying, again, not taking the Bible as anything other than a historical document. It is like the historical document. Okay. Any questions about the bibliographical text? And later on, we're going to kind of do some archaeology, and I'll show you pictures of some of these papyri and stuff that I think are cool. Next test, internal test. What does the book say about itself? In other words, do the Bible texts claim to be recounting things that they heard about on the street? Or do they claim to be recounting things that were eyewitness testimony? So 2 of the 4 gospel texts were written by eyewitnesses. 2 were written by close associates of eyewitnesses, or in the case of Luke, he went and interviewed the apostles, possibly even Mary and people like that at the time, and developed his argument, his document, which reads like a history book. I mean, it really does. Luke, the book of Luke is written like a history document. It starts off saying, I have studied all of this closely, and I'm going to present to you everything that I've learned. Okay, so what do they claim for themselves? In the case of the New Testament documents, they claim to either have been written by eyewitnesses of the events recounted, such as John's gospel and epistles and Peter's epistles, or to things that have been written by close associates of eyewitnesses based on careful research. So, let's see if I have Luke. Luke 1-4. Inasmuch as many have, Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Acts 4:19, but Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge, for we cannot speak of what, let me try that again. We cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. Yeah. So again, they're saying what we're telling you is what we have seen and heard. John 1:1-3, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and we have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. Again, that which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. I am terrible at reading text. My eyes go all over the place, so bear with me. Okay, so why are we doing Bible verses? We're doing Bible verses because we're doing the internal test about what does this document that's handed to us say about itself. Does it say it's poetry? Does it say it's fiction? Does it say it's hearsay? Or does it say that it's eyewitness testimony that's being presented? And it says it's eyewitness testimony. So to discount such claims on an objective basis requires better sources refuting what the New Testament materials say of themselves, and such sources do not exist. You don't see equivalent pedigree sources refuting what the gospel texts proclaim, which you would expect to see. Again, this gets to these documents were being written while people hostile to the Christian faith were in existence. So if things were being said about like where Jesus was at a certain time of the year, all the people who were there at that time of the year, that place, could have said, well, no, he wasn't. I was here. And that would have been a hostile text recorded, and we would have gotten that also. And it would have definitely called into question what we see in the gospel text. But we don't have that. That's not written down. Okay. In the first letter to the church in Corinth, Dr. Gary Habermas argues that Paul states a creed, a statement of belief. That's all a creed, the word creed means, is I believe. If it starts with I believe, it's probably a creed. So he argues that Paul is stating a creed using rabbinic terms, received and delivered, indicating that he's passing along a holy tradition. So what you receive, you deliver perfectly. That was the tradition. Paul used Cephas, the Aramaic name for Peter, also indicating that the creed is developed very early. This is the first Corinthians 15 creed that we'll show in a second here. Therefore, the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is established immediately upon the death and resurrection of Jesus. It did not develop slowly over the course of centuries. This is in the case for Christ. James D.G. Dunn of the University of Durham, a fellow of the British Academy, said, this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as the tradition within months of Jesus' death. And this is back to 1 Corinthians. This is a letter to the Corinthians, so Paul writing says, For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to me when untimely born, he appeared to me, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. So, what I heard, I delivered. What I received, I delivered. That's rabbinic language. And then the fact that he uses Cephas as a name for Peter. Okay. Okay, it's apparent that there was an oral tradition that preceded Paul's letters and the gospel text dating right back to the time of Christ's resurrection. So again, what do the texts claim about themselves? They claim to be factual and not myth. So 1 Peter 1:16, for we did not follow cleverly devised myths, when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So again, the Bible starts with, in the beginning God, not once upon a time. Yeah. Any questions? We're kind of running out of time, so we are probably not going to start the external test of the argument from lower textual criticism, the external test. So we're not going to start that today because it takes a long time.
Quickly, can you tell us who Josephus was?
Josephus? Yeah. So Josephus was a very early historian. I've got a collection of Josephus. It's the very big book that's on the table back there. But he had access to the rabbinic writings, the Old Testament scrolls, all this kind of stuff. And he basically wrote what's almost a companion to the Old Testament that has a little bit more historical context added to it. So he is essentially used as one of the earliest historians. He's not necessarily one of the strictest historians. He's a little bit of a color commentator on top of being an historian. But what's nice about him is he actually has a text that's talking about the existence of Christianity in Jesus, and it would have been dated less than 100 AD. So he's a valuable resource for Christians. He was born in 37. So, any other questions? Okay, so next week we're going to talk about the external tests, and then we will continue on from there. I think, why don't we go ahead and close it in prayer? How about that? So thank you again, Lord, bringing all these wonderful people here into your house to hear your word, and help all of us to continue to grow in our knowledge of the Bible, both as a historical document and the inspired, inerrant word of you, and so that we can grow in our ability to witness to others without fear. Amen.